So my name's Finn Bell. I'm a brand new assistant professor in human services and chess. So I've learned a lot from you all on this panel, and there's a lot that I'm going to integrate into my own classes that my students who are here now can tell you I don't currently do. But I think the classes would be much better if I did, so I certainly will. So the things that I'm really going to talk about today is, so I guess one of the sort of biggest organizing piece of what I'm talking about is actually talking about hope and hope in the classroom. And so the slide that would be here is a quote from the Dalai Lama, which is, "Hope is the antidote to despair." And I think so many of the mental health struggles that we see on campus and everywhere else, as well as a lot of our larger political problems, are all problems of despair. And when I say hope, as Rebecca Solnit says in her book Hope in the Dark, which there's a picture of, uh, hope is not the same as optimism. Hope is not just this belief that like everything will be fine and we just have to think positively about it, right? I'm talking about what Buddhist eco-philosopher Joanna Macy calls active hope, right? So active hope is a practice like gardening or Tai Chi. It's something that you have to cultivate. And she talks about 3 steps to cultivating active hope. The first is, as Patrick sort of modeled actually in his presentation, right? First, we have to be really real about where we are and what the situation is that we're in, including potentially how dire the situation is that we're in. So that's the first step. The second step is to think about what change you want to make, what change needs to be made, what values you want to see embodied. And then the third is actually taking action to make that change and to embody those values, right? And so all of this is, again, it's not sort of this like toxic positivity. It's actually, that we are responsible for what happens. It's not a hope that doesn't involve us. We have to be responsible. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is, as a couple other panelists have said, I think hope is also really intimately tied to meaning. There's a quote that I'm summarizing from Václav Havel, which is, hope is the certainty that something has meaning regardless of the outcome. And particularly when we're talking about these much larger problems, so I work on environmental justice and climate change issues, so certainly thinking about that, thinking about sort of the unveiling of mainstreaming of white supremacy, explicit white supremacy, threats to democracy, like all of these are really big problems, and none of us can know what will end up happening, but we can know that we're doing good, meaningful work. And I think that for me, that's a lot of what I try to encourage with students and make my classroom an environment in which we're doing. Meaning, as we know, is and I should say, sorry, so I'm human services, I am a social worker, but I'm not a clinical social worker. My PhD is in social work and sociology, and I'm much more on the macro community organizing end. So take everything I say that's clinical with a grain of salt, as other people have said. But we do know that meaning is very important to mental health and mental well-being, right? As Viktor Frankl, said, as someone who survived concentration camp, someone who has a why can survive almost any how. And so, we know how important meaning is, but we also have to actually change those hows. We have to change the how of how we're living. And so I want to just talk briefly, especially as someone who's, very new to this campus, but, also I think a lot about my own experience as a student, and it's related to a lot of what other folks have talked about. But so I went to college in 2001, which means, a few weeks in, September 11th, 2001 happened. And although I was incredibly insulated from that as, where I was, and as not being someone who was targeted by the aftermath, either, it was so jarring and disorienting to feel like the whole world is falling down around you, and yet you're still just supposed to show up to class and have studied and done the readings, and, and that was a really disorienting experience for me, but I, as some other folks have talked about, I really internalized that. And on top of a lot of other things, not all of which I'll go into, but I did actually end up like dropping out of college mid-semester, but eventually came back, obviously, because I'm here now. But so anyways, but I remember really just thinking that was my own failing, right? Like what was wrong with me? Why was I so sensitive? All this stuff. And it wasn't until I was actually doing my PhD at University of Michigan-Ann Arbor, and I was working for the Center for Research on Learning and Teaching. And we had sort of this demand from instructors after the 2016 election when, our marginalized students were really being targeted by, and just in these horrible, intense ways. And instructors were saying, what do I do? Like, do I talk about this in class? Do I not talk about it in class? I don't know what to do. So we started developing this workshop, Teaching in Tumultuous Times. And as I was sort of diving into the research around teaching and learning and about how you engage the outside world and the societal stressors, as I know Pam Aronson was going to talk about, all of the research was on people who were in college during 9/11. And it all showed that basically instructors who don't acknowledge what's happening in the outside world, it severely impacts student learning outcomes, right? And I would say also student mental health. But so, in this workshop we developed, we really started talking about how, like, you have to acknowledge it. You have to acknowledge all of the things, as Grace so eloquently said, right? Like all the systems that students are embedded in. And it's better to do, it's of course best to do that skillfully, but it's better to do it than to not do it, right? And there are ways to do that skillfully. But I want to also go beyond sort of acknowledging to thinking about how do we make meaning in the classroom, right? And so some of the work that I did as a researcher, which I won't get into deeply, but I was, at this Catholic Eco-Justice Center where, these people were really dedicating their whole lives to environmental work. And one of the big problems with that is, of course, we have really hard feelings that come up when we think about the environmental crises that we face, right? And it's part of why burnout is so rampant in those fields and everything else. So I wanted to talk to them about, how do you cope? How do you do this every day and still be okay, right? Still keep showing up. And they had all those same feelings the rest of us do. There was nothing magical. They all talked about despair. They talked about other hard feelings. But they really talked about how they actively cultivate hope. And the way they did that was by using 3 strategies. By finding community, so finding community with each other, but also finding community, with other people who came and went through the center and with the greater web of life, through taking action. So as soon as they really came to terms with, the crises and their complicity in it, they really transformed their whole ministry to really be focused on ecological justice. And then practicing spirituality, right? And not religion, but practicing all kinds of diverse spiritualities. And so I really think that those are lessons that I at least try to take into the classroom, right? And I think that's part of why Dearborn was such a great fit for me, right? Because it is a community-engaged university, right? We're talking about how do we connect people with, connect students with, outside community folks, but also how do we build community in the classroom? And I love some of the practices that you were talking about, Lisa. And then taking action, right? I mean, hopefully, if done well, right, practice-based learning is doing things where we are actually taking real action. People, are doing meaningful projects to them. And that's why in my classes, I always have the students pick the things that they really care about and that they really do want to take action on. And then I love that we started and we're about to end this panel with a meditation, because I really have not been in a lot of institutions where there sort of is an acceptance of that. And I really think that's so important. It's such a place of comfort, and also it helps us to remember that we're just one tiny part of a much larger whole. And so I just want to close by, again, sort of echoing Patrick and others, but by talking about how important agency is, right? So personal agency, all of these practices are things that help us to reclaim agency. Personal agency is essential to mental health and mental well-being, but also collective agency is the only force that's powerful enough to actually change these conditions in which we're living. And so I think that, for me, I really want to cultivate both of those things so the classroom really can be a place that, nurtures hope. So thank you.